Hey, everybody. Welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have author and writer Susan Glasser with us today, and we will get to Susan in just a second. But first, this.
We've all seen the images, and they put to the test two fundamental American principles. The first is the right to free speech and for people to peacefully assemble and make their voices heard. The second is the rule of law. Both must be upheld. We are not an authoritarian nation where we silence people or squash dissent. The American people are heard. In fact, peaceful protest is in the best tradition of how Americans respond to consequential issues. But, neither are we a lawless country. We are a civil society, and order must prevail. So let me be clear. Peaceful protest in America. Violent protest is not protected. Peaceful protest is. There's the right to protest, but not the right to cause chaos. People have the right to get an education, the right to get a degree, the right to walk across the campus safely without fear of being attacked. But let's be clear about this as well. There should be no place on any campus, no place in America for anti-Semitism or threats of violence against Jewish students. There is no place for hate speech or violence of any kind, whether it's anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or discrimination against Arab Americans or Palestinian Americans. It's simply wrong. There's no place for racism in America.
So the back room today is going to look a little different. It's going to feel a little different. It's going to sound a lot different. We've all seen what's happened in our country this week across colleges and universities. The hot button issue of Israel and Gaza and Hamas and Palestinians, which I'm not going to say began after the October 7th attack, because this is an issue that, for me, goes back centuries. But just the recent months of strife in this country is a very serious thing. So we're going to do something a little differently than normal. I'm going to start with our rant, which is really more like a statement than it is a rant. And it's a bit longer than usual. But as an American Jew, as a Zionist, I have a lot of feelings on this subject. And it's important to me that I clearly articulate those thoughts. And I often feel that I'm a much better writer than I am a speaker. All right, so I got to just say that I'm so disgusted by what I've witnessed this week at Columbia, UCLA, University of Wisconsin, etc. These so-called peaceful protests have evolved into something much more nefarious, hateful, unlawful, and dangerous. Sure, some of the protesters are law-abiding and well-intentioned, despite my personal opinion that many of them are also incredibly naive, misguided, and or just plain ignorant of history and context. But illegal encampments, the storming into and seizing of buildings, and destruction of property, the harassment, bullying, and blockading of Jewish students, screaming at and throwing bottles at cops while ignoring orders to disperse and vacate, this is unconscionable behavior, and it warrants arrest, suspension, and or expulsion. But let's just set the record straight. I'm a liberal Democrat. I'm a patriot. I love our democracy. And I have unwavering support for free speech and the right to demonstrate. But I also believe in the rule of law. And the rule of law isn't subjective. It's black and white. You break the law, you violate the school's codes of conduct, you get punished. You don't have any right whatsoever to justify your lawlessness by claiming your cause is so special, so different, so righteous, that it puts you above the law. Imagine for a second if we all broke the law, if we all felt it was, quote, justified, if we engaged in vigilante justice because, quote, we just had to take the law into our own hands because no one else was. That's called anarchy. The First Amendment protects your right to assemble and express your views through protest. But what it does not allow you to do is violate others' rights in the process. In this case, the right of students to be able to pursue their studies in a productive and safe environment. It doesn't give you the right to cause school shutdowns or graduation ceremony cancellations. It doesn't give you the right to prevent Jewish students from entering or moving freely through campus. And it doesn't give you the right to call for violence and or death against a certain group of individuals based on their race, religion, or ethnicity. It does not give you the right to cause chaos. And I don't care if the protesters are students or outsiders or both. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who they are. At Columbia, they smashed doors and windows with hammers to break into and illegally occupy Hamilton Hall. By the way, it's pretty rich to protest what you believe is illegal occupation by illegally occupying other people's property. They locked the doors with giant link chains and zip ties, and they trashed the place. I'm sorry, but I don't give a shit what you believe in. I don't care how passionate you are about your cause. You don't get to do that. There are hundreds of people sitting in prison now because they did that on January 6th. And so if you're now sitting in a jail cell, that's because you belong there. And if you're a student now facing expulsion, you were warned several times. This is on you. What's more, these protesters wearing masks are a bunch of cowards. What are they afraid of? Losing a cushy job or internship? Real courage is standing up for what you believe in, even if it means showing your face at great personal sacrifice. Lastly, as to the accusations of genocide by Israel, let me read the definition of genocide. The, quote, intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. You know what? There has been genocide. It occurred in Israel on October 7th, when 1,200 innocent men, women, children, and babies were raped, tortured, killed, beheaded, and or burned alive just for being Jewish. That was the genocide, by every definition of the word. Israel's retaliation, a nation defending itself from a barbaric enemy committed to destroying it, does not constitute genocide. It's called war. And war is ugly, war is dangerous, and war is deadly. And innocent people get killed, especially when they're used as human shields by their own leaders. And for the record, chanting from the river to the sea is not cool. It's not a chant for freedom. It literally calls for the genocide of the Israeli people. I would think that this would matter to the anti-genocide protesters, but sadly, it doesn't. Because I think most of them couldn't even tell you which river and which sea. And genocide apparently is okay when it's against Jews. So, let me tell you a little bit about Susan Glasser. She's a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she writes a weekly column on life in Washington. She's served as a top editor of several Washington publications, including Politico, where she founded the award-winning Politico Magazine, and Foreign Policy, which won 3 National Magazine Awards, among others, during her tenure as editor-in-chief. Before that, she worked for a decade at the Washington Post, where she was the editor of Outlook and National News. She also oversaw coverage of the impeachment of Bill Clinton, served as a reporter covering the intersection of money and politics, spent 4 years as the Post's Moscow co-bureau chief, and covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. She edited Roll Call, a Capitol Hill newspaper, early in her career. Her books include Kremlin Rising, The Man Who Ran Washington, and most recently, The Divider, a best-selling history of Donald Trump in the White House, which she co-wrote with her husband, Peter Baker. Susan, welcome into the back room.
Oh, thank you so much. Great to be with you.
So you have a new piece out in The New Yorker titled, Is 2024 Doomed to Repeat 1968 or 2020? Or both? And you start out writing about Trump's response this week to a reporter's question about the election. Quote, if everything's honest, I'll gladly accept the results. If it's not, you have to fight for the right of the country. How are we back in this same chilling place yet again?
Well, look, first of all, obviously, as long as Donald Trump is running, we can say pretty definitively that he's likely not to accept the result of any election that he doesn't win, because that's how he's behaved his entire life, even before he got into politics. When he didn't win an Oscar or an Emmy, he said that the vote was rigged against him. So I suppose it's not really a shocker that Donald Trump says that he's preparing to pull a 2020 all over again. but it's extremely significant. His entire campaign is based on the false premise of his non-defeat in 2020, and I think he's said very clearly now, in a much more explicit way, not just that he won't concede defeat, but he's using the term "fight." He's using the same rallying cry essentially to his followers, which is become violent rejectionism of basically the constitutional order. So I think it's an important moment.
Hmm. Are we literally living in Groundhog Day? Because you're raising a really great point in the sense that, are we really just going to see every single thing exactly the same as we've seen before? We know Donald Trump's not a very complicated man. We know he's not intellectually curious. He's not a very articulate dude. Are we going to just see the same little, like if this was a Leonard Skinner concert, are we just going to hear Freebird over and over and over again? And why should we be shocked about any of it?
Look, Donald Trump is a 77-year-old man who has one soundtrack, right, in the album. I mean, come on, let's be real here. We don't know a lot of 77-year-olds who are changing who they are fundamentally anyways, not to mention someone who's very carefully created this entire kind of myth, this brand, this image of himself is everything to Donald Trump. He is a creature of television. He's a creature of the media. So who he is who he is, not in some authentic, genuine way, but in the sense that he's selling us the same product, and he thinks it's a great product. He thinks that, he himself is the reason why he won in 2016. And, the difference for folks between that election in 2020 and 2024 is that it's the same old Trump, but with a whole new set of grievances and an almost existential fear of being thrown into jail and the consequences he doesn't win. And so I think that's where we see the escalation this time. It's not that Donald Trump is suddenly a different guy, but that actually the threat he poses to the country in many ways is more significant. He has a different set of people around him now, 4 years of experience in the White House, and a sense of an agenda of righting the wrongs done to him, revenge, retribution, grievance, termination even of the Constitution. Those are things he didn't talk about in 2016 that he's talking about now.
Mm-hmm. There was something you wrote as well that really struck a chord with me. It basically is about how he's telegraphing yet another possible violent insurrection and how it went largely unreported. So I want to get right to what I believe is the ultimate question here. Because of this type of reporting, or lack thereof, how much is the media to blame for Trump trampling on the Constitution, subverting the rule of law, spreading 40,000 plus lies, and twisting reality into this dizzying whirlwind that we're all living with for the past 9 years? How much are they to blame for that, to your point?
Look, let's be very clear about something. Donald Trump is accountable for Donald Trump's actions. Donald Trump and Donald Trump alone. No matter who you have cheerleading for you or reporting or not reporting what you're doing and saying, the bottom line is Donald Trump woke up in the morning after the 2020 election. He had his advisors telling him he lost. He had his own daughter and son-in-law understanding that he lost the election. He had legal teams. He had judges all across the country who failed to rule for him in these things. He had his attorney general, Bill Barr, telling him there's no evidence of fraud. What did he do? He is accountable for the lies, the misinformation, and that he offered the American public and the division that followed. Now, I would say that Donald Trump, without an entire ecosystem and infrastructure of Republican Party enablers, in my view, we wrote this in The Divider, the book on Trump in the White House that I wrote with my husband, that, without the Republican Party, Donald Trump is just an old dude, an angry old dude in a, golf club shouting at the television, in between golf games, right? So it's not to say that he and he alone is responsible for this phenomenon in our public life. But I do think part of the problem is that he believes himself to be not accountable. And in many ways, institutions throughout Donald Trump's life have failed again and again and again to impose accountability, to impose consequences for actions that he took that violated laws, rules, and norms.
Well, you're 100% right about the buck stops at Donald Trump. But let's just break that down just a little bit further, because, you now raise an interesting point about the Republican enablers. But also you have a co-equal branch of government. You have a Congress which has abdicated its ultimate responsibility. And now, over the last several months, we're starting to see that maybe the judicial system isn't what it's supposed to be. And, either leaning in Trump's direction, as is the case with Judge Aileen Cannon, perhaps, or just kicking cans down the road like the Supreme Court is doing with immunity. So all of these factors together, and then if you question the media, how long did it take the media to say, okay, he's not misrepresenting the truth, he's lying, right? So how much are all these other parties really involved in this phenomena, to use your word, of Donald Trump?
Look, I think it's a very important question. In my view, Trump has long been, essentially, he's a stress test for institutions and individuals. Put a different way, he is, what he does is he puts enormous pressure to find the fault lines, to find the weaknesses, to find the fissures and fractures into which he might lean, into which he might seek advantage. Somebody said, he's an X-ray for other people's souls. And, what we haven't liked a lot of what we found when the Trump X-ray machine, to abuse this metaphor, has exposed them. And I think you're right that there are these institutional weaknesses in Congress. The most important check on a rogue president that the founding writers of our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence, they envisioned Congress as an institutional check through the mechanism of impeachment and an impeachment trial. And instead, they didn't really foresee, unfortunately, that partisan affiliation would trump, so to speak, the institutional affiliation in Congress. And what that means is that impeachment is a dead letter for Donald Trump, or frankly, for almost any other president right now. So that's a weakness in our system, in the sense that the founders really, the Constitution was written before there were formal political parties. Now the political parties are more important than the fact that you are a member of the U.S. Senate in determining what you do. So that's one weakness. There is the weakness of the political parties themselves, and the Republican Party, if it wasn't already at war within, Donald Trump wouldn't have been able to execute what Jared Kushner at one point called the hostile takeover of the party from outside. Donald Trump wasn't some GOP stalwart. He had changed parties 5 different times. So that's a weakness that he found. Obviously, there's the weaknesses in individual characters who clearly let ambition get the best of them. Look at the sort of hollow souls like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham, who've gone from scathing, clear-eyed critics of Donald Trump to basically, puppy dog sycophants. Marco Rubio in particular is really remarkable as he tries to make himself into a viable candidate for Trump's vice president now. It's amazing stuff. That's a weakness. And the media. Look, we've been asking ourselves these questions for so long. In fact, back in the 2016 cycle, I was just remembering this. I guess it's the 8th anniversary of an issue I published when I was the editor of Politico Magazine that was our annual media issue, which came out every spring. And the cover was Donald Trump in 2016 and a picture, and the headline was, "What have we done?" The media issue. And so, there's a kind of a stressful circularity to these debates, right? I'm amazed that we're still having many of the exact same debates that we were having in the spring of 2016.
Well, I was just going to say that, putting all of this aside, which is, intellectual analysis and conversation, I don't think anyone with even a half a brain on January 7th, 2021 could ever envision that on May 3rd, 2024, we would be where we are today with Donald Trump. And I just think there's so much blame to go around for that. It's just unfathomable that we are still here, like you said, talking about the same things over and over and over. It is Groundhog Day. It's crazy. But I want to tie this conversation that we're having back to your article. because, you make comparisons and you ask questions and there's discussion about 1968 and references to 68. In 1968, just from my, I was 9 years old in 1968, so this is all from history books as far as I'm concerned. But people went to Nixon and they were like, dude, it's over, you got to go. And he was like, okay, you got me. Right? Like, they didn't worry back then that Congress would support him, that Republicans would support him, that the courts would back him, that everyone would just roll over and just throw out every core principle they have for Nixon. The system worked at the very beginning. It didn't need to go further. Today, Trump is just breaking through boundary after barrier, after barricade, after legal norm and standard and rules and laws. And so I'm curious to know, from your perspective, do you see it as so wildly different than 68? 2020 is a whole different animal because it's still Trump. But where do you think we've come in terms of all this in relation to 68?
Well, look, history rhymes, but it doesn't necessarily directly repeat. I think it's important to point that out. And I wasn't alive in 1968, but I do think that it has this sort of iconic status in a way as like, the mother of all horrible political years in many ways in the country. The country was really felt like it was on the brink. I think if you talk with people who experienced it, if you read the histories, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and of Bobby Kennedy, there was a feeling of the wheels coming off society. There had been riots starting in the previous summer and continuing in the summer of 1968. There was a growing sense that there was a kind of a generational war between the older generation and this new, assertive, very large group of baby boomers in colleges. They were talking revolution. There was an enormous difference, of course, also between the Vietnam War, which was the cause that brought students into the street. Their lives were potentially at stake, right? We had the draft in this country at that time. Young men were being forced to fight and die for a cause they didn't believe in a country thousands and thousands of miles away. So there was a perception around the stakes that I think we have to appreciate that, makes some of what's happening today feel a little bit like, the historical reenactors are at it, that it's a sort of a internet era cosplay version of 1968, but at the same time, there is a sense that there were still guardrails around the society, as you said, that the institutions function. And I think that what Donald Trump did and his supporters after the 2020 election, seeking to overturn a lawful election, sending a mob of violent insurrectionists to the U.S. Capitol to stop the vote counting. This was essentially shattering the ultimate safety net, the view that no matter how contentious or negative or nasty or even potentially violent our political rhetoric got, that we were still operating within the same system. And I think that the fear now around Trump and his backers is that they may no longer essentially believe in the system in a way that makes us much more vulnerable, even potentially, than we were at that time. But I do think it's important to recognize that the level of political violence and assassinations that framed 1968, even the difference between, there are much passion, obviously, around those who are protesting today for the cause of Palestinian freedom and what's against what's happening in Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza with American support. But that's not the same thing as American young men being drafted and fighting and dying in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. Nor is it the same when there's chaos in America that's created by the opposition to the things you talked about, war and civil rights and things like that, versus it coming from the White House. Like that's a key distinction.
Remember that Nixon called himself in 1968 the, quote, law and order candidate. Mm-hmm. That was a very effective message for him. There were other advantages that Nixon had, in particular the divisions in the Democratic Party, not just between the young protest movement. Hubert Humphrey was really saddled with all the downsides of LBJ's presidency, including the war in Vietnam, without the upsides. He didn't also have the real full support of the president himself, who decided very late in March of 1968 that he wasn't going to run again because of his extreme unpopularity due to the war. And, so Humphrey was sort of squeezed in all ways. Biden, as an incumbent president, has his own legislative record to run on. There's a lot of people who are very supportive of that record. There's also the abortion factor here, which we haven't talked about, but that has proven to be a real rallying point for Democrats, for suburban women, the key voters that Biden would need to be reelected. I think that they perceive that Donald Trump was responsible, really, for this Supreme Court and for the overturning of Roe versus Wade in a way that is impacting millions of American women's lives in a very concrete way, right? Not in just in rhetoric this year. So, there are, I think, big differences, but he decided to have the convention in Chicago. Really, I feel like whatever you think about whether history is right or not, is it really a good idea? I am dreading all those images of, then and now, 1968, cops beating protesters, and seems crazy.
Well, you cite Meghan McCain, who tweeted this week, quote, "The DNC convention this summer is going to be a fucking shit show." Is she wrong? It sounds like she's not.
Let's just put it this way. It's certainly the conventional wisdom that
no
that
pun
is
intended.
a likely scenario. Exactly.
So I normally sleep pretty well. I normally am pretty optimistic about November. Then I read your piece. And the thing about what you wrote that is sort of altering my sleep patterns just a little bit now is the references to 68. Because you can look at the differences, but then you can also focus on the similarities. And that today's American, in large part, I think, isn't too engaged in politics. We live in a bumper sticker society. We all know about how corrupted the Republican base has become over the years through the right-wing media ecosystem, Donald Trump's incessant lying, his enablers, spreading the lies. And so just on its face, you have another so-called law and order president, right? Donald Trump. We now have these protests, the accusations that Joe Biden not only can't keep us safe at the border, but we're losing safety on college campuses. And, 68, that's why Nixon got elected. Is that a real concern now?
Look, one of the striking facets of where we are in terms of politics is that because of the way our system works, because we're such a deeply divided country right now, we're not talking about a real national election. We're talking about a pretty undemocratic small d system in which there's not only an electoral college, which gives disproportionate weight to certain smaller, less populated, more Republican states, but we're also just talking about a small handful of battleground states where there's any kind of competitive election today. And so it's not about those national poll numbers. It's about a small number of perhaps lower information voters who are undecided. And really, it's pretty hard to be undecided about Donald Trump, nearly 9 years into the Trump political phenomenon. So, again, think about what's the population of person who's going to end up deciding this election in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, maybe Nevada. That's it. That's the whole deal as far as this election goes. It's a very small number of states. Americans otherwise have sorted themselves geographically, by education level. They're not demographically mixing anymore. That means they're not politically mixing anymore. So we're left with a small number of people who, the polite euphemism is low information voter. But come on, it's very hard to be undecided about Trump right now. And that means it's a particularly challenging group of people to get any kind of information across that they're willing to actually believe.
So you end your piece with something that I 100% agree with. Quote, "The truth is that it's far too early to know whether the historical dread that many Democrats feel about a 1968 redux is warranted. Maybe by the fall, the war in Gaza will no longer be front and center. Perhaps by then, the students will be more focused on Trump's threats to their reproductive freedom, their democracy, or consumed by some other Trumpian outrage that has yet to occur, end quote. Isn't that the more likely scenario, that this dust settles and that people end up going into that voting booth and say, okay, I got this choice, that's it. One guy's crazy, one guy's not. This shit I don't like, but the other guy is literally going to burn this country to the ground. Hold my nose, vote for Biden.
Yeah, I mean, look, that is always been, if not a likely scenario, maybe even the likely scenario.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is we don't know what we don't know. I've always believed that it's the prospect of a destabilizing or decisive event in the last couple of weeks of the election that is the most likely scenario. And I don't even think that's speculative, right? We really saw that happen already in 2016. That's in many ways probably the reason that Trump became president in the first place. The combination of destabilizing events at the very end of that race, including, of course, Comey's decision to reopen very briefly his investigation into Hillary Clinton before closing it just a few days before the election. It was an extraordinary thing. But in a race that close, any number of factors could have decided it. And I think that's what we're looking at again here. I can't see a crystal ball. 6 months ago, we were just a month into the conflict between Israel and Hamas. We didn't know where it was going. Where will it be 6 months from now? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Bobby Kennedy Jr., what's his impact to you?
It's interesting. We just had a whole conversation about this in the New Yorker podcast I do with my colleagues Jane Mayer and Evan Osnos about RFK Jr. for this week's episode. And it's a topic I've been reluctant to address, but I think we now have to address it. And that is because he is now on the ballot in Michigan. Mm-hmm. And it looks like he'll be on the ballot in North Carolina and Nevada. Mm-hmm. And so, it to me, it's irrelevant where he's landing in the national polls. But with Michigan already looking like perhaps the decisive state this year, the fact that he's on the ballot there, I think, is gotta worry Democrats. I am noticing that there's kind of a battle between the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign right now to define Bobby Kennedy, in part because his ideology is so undefined. What do you know anything about him? What do you know? You know that he's a sort of an anti-vaxxer, COVID denier. That seems to play right into kind of the Trump base. But of course, he has the magic Kennedy last name for Democrats and a background long ago as an environmentalist. So, I think there's a certain worry on both sides. But, I'm mindful of my dad, the lawyer's old question, cui bono, who benefits? Mm-hmm. And in that respect, I think it's notable that one of Kennedy's largest donors is one of the largest donors to the Republican Party, an heir to the Mellon banking fortune, who's given literally tens of millions of dollars to Kennedy as well as to Trump. At least some people clearly are putting their money where their mouth is and believe that Kennedy is a benefit to Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm. But Donald Trump is also a human mood ring, right? He's not a complicated man. I've said this before. So when he's relentlessly attacking RFK Jr., doesn't that sort of indicate that he and his camp are worried about Bobby?
Sure it does. Trump's tweets or his true socials, they're sort of a mirror to a troubled soul, right? He tends to say out loud, but he's also a manipulator, Trump, and he has messages and that he wants to get across. He's a marketer, essentially. Mm-hmm. He's an online marketer of great skill, I think. And remember that he may wish to plant the idea that RFK Jr. is a leftist in order to get disaffected Democrats, especially, Democratic young men, to vote for him. People who might not be willing to vote for Donald Trump, but don't necessarily want to vote for Biden. That, it seems to me, is what Trump is trying to encourage. And frankly, that's the scenario that's the most risky and dangerous for the Biden campaign. Years ago, we were based in Moscow as correspondents during the years of Putin's rise and consolidation of power. And at this time, what his advisors called the system was, quote, managed democracy. What did that mean? It meant that they were going to manage it directly out of the Kremlin. And one of the techniques that they had was to create fake political parties in their parliamentary elections that were all run come up with by the Kremlin's political strategists, run, including their message. What were they trying to do? They were literally trying to do the same thing that RFK Jr. is trying to do. They were trying to siphon off voters from the real opposition into a fake opposition. And to me, that's the analogy that I've been thinking a lot about these last few months.
Mm-hmm. So my last question is kind of like a three-parter. It's the New York trial that Donald Trump is sitting in right now, week 2. How much do you think his legal problems, in particular that he could be a convicted felon perhaps by early June, how much is that going to impact the election? And is he finally, are the dominoes finally falling in terms of holding him accountable? And is so much of the rest of the stuff we're talking about more noise than the fact that in just a few weeks we could have a presidential nominee who's a convicted felon?
Yeah, I mean, let's just say it's not a good label even for Donald Trump to take to the voters. It is without precedent in American history, and as so much about Donald Trump is. And I have continued to believe it's significant for a small but potentially crucial subset of Republican voters. You could argue that, in fact, this is the same group of Republicans who are responsible for Biden becoming the president in the first place, people who just felt qualms about Donald Trump, even if they were partisan Republicans. There's some evidence among those groups that it would really matter. Now, even if you discount polls that suggest that there's a pretty decent percentage, maybe 20% of Republicans who say they wouldn't want to vote for a convicted felon. Okay, well, let's say a lot of those have been used to making excuses for Donald Trump. But even if it's just 6%, 5%, 2% in a really close race, that could make a real difference. I think it's notable in that respect that Nikki Haley, the main opponent to Donald Trump in the end in the Republican primaries, continued to get up to 20% of the Republican primary vote, even months after she dropped out in some states. And that's the logical kind of group of voters to target with a message around Trump as a convicted felon, if that's what comes out of the New York case. But again, it's speculative until it happens.
So basically what you're saying is with 6 months left and a million balls up in the air, who the hell knows where this is going to go?
Right, exactly.
That's what we can safely conclude.
I think we're on safe ground on that one, not going out on a limb.
But it will be crazy, and I do appreciate you coming on, and I do hope you'll come back and continue this conversation, because there's certainly going to be a ton to talk about between now and then.
Well, thank you for having me, Andy. It's a great conversation and an important one, and I'm delighted to be with you today.
All righty. Take care.
Bye.
This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg, and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.